Welcome to the APEROLiker build tutorial. We start with the assembly of the drip tray. Firstly, the nuts are inserted into the drip tray, which serve to weigh it down. The nuts are then glued with superglue. The lid has a precise fit and is also fixed in place with a small amount of superglue. It is best to use such clips to hold the components in place while gluing until they are dry. Finally, glue the grill in place and fix it again with clamps. To complete the control panel, the heat inserts must first be melted in. Make sure that they are melted in vertically. Any residue left over from melting can be removed with a cutter knife. Next, the decorative ring is glued in place and temporarily fixed with the nut of the rotary encoder until it dries. First, solder the cables to the piezo buzzer and melt the heat shrink tubing. Use a lighter or hot air gun for this. Then twist the cable neatly. The same is repeated for the display. It is best to choose the right color for the cables. This will make wiring much easier later on. twist the cables and set aside. The encoder also has its cables soldered on. The cables can also be cut to the correct length at this stage. The lengths can be taken from the overview in the instructions. Final assembly of the control panel. Firstly, the rotary encoder is screwed in. Now the rotary encoder knob can be fitted and fixed in place with the grub screw. The piezo buzzer is fixed in place with a little superglue. Before mounting the display, remove the protective film, insert it and fix it in place with hot glue. All heat inserts are melted into the housing first. Again, make sure that they are melted in vertically. Some are a little more difficult to reach with a soldering iron. Make sure that the housing is not damaged by the heat of the soldering iron. Use the cutter knife to cut off the protruding residue and clean the contact surfaces for the attachments. Mounting the push button for the dispensing. The push button must first be prepared. To do this, the legs on one side are snipped off flush. The legs on the other side are bent flat with pliers. After soldering the cables, insulate them with heat shrink tubing. The next step is to prepare the LEDs. These power LEDs are best glued in the housing if they are soldered to a small piece of circuit board. The LEDs are soldered in series with short cables between them as shown in the circuit diagram in the manual. The 12V socket also has cables, which are protected as usual with shrink tubing. When gluing in the push button, it is very important to ensure that the push button can move freely. When gluing in the LEDs, it is advisable not to use too much superglue so that the LEDs do not become matte. Finally, the 12V socket is screwed in. Once the button, the LEDs, and the 12V socket have been fitted, the lever can be screwed in place. After screwing it in, test whether the button works. You should hear a click. Now screw the control panel in place. The heat inserts are melted in first. The pumps can then be screwed together. To fit the feet, ensure that the black elements are on the correct side. The side to which the orange feet must be attached has a phase. Attach the feet and glue them invisibly on the inside with superglue. The end piece is pressed into the top of the aluminium profiles and also glued in place. Finally, the aluminium profile is glued into the Blackfoot elements and the process is repeated for all 4 feet. After drying, you can test whether the extension feet fit into the actual feet of the APEROLiker. Caution, do not glue them here, they should remain pluggable at the end. Before installing the DC-DC converters, they must be set to the correct voltage. This is done using a laboratory power supply unit and a multimeter. The DC-DC converters can then be connected to the previously prepared power section board. It is advisable to provide the DC-DC converters with cables beforehand, and to wrap them in large shrink sleeves so that no short circuit occurs later during assembly. Then connect the DC-DC converters to the power board according to the circuit diagram and the manual.
Once the converters are connected, the cables for the pumps can be prepared and soldered in. These are also twisted so that they can be laid neatly later. The pump cables are soldered to the pumps. Pay attention to the polarity of the pumps. This should be tested beforehand with a laboratory power supply unit, as these are unfortunately not always labeled correctly. Once all the cables have been soldered to the power board, it can be glued into the housing. Tip: firstly, only use enough glue to keep the board in place. If it turns out later that a mistake was made when soldering the board, it will be easier to remove it again. Finally, the microcontroller is connected with all cables according to the circuit diagram. The test firmware must be installed before closing the housing to avoid the tedious search for wiring errors later on. Tip: make sure that the USB-C DC on boot option of the Wemos S2 Mini is switched on. This ensures that the ESP32S2 can be programmed later without pressing the buttons. Finally, the cables are organized and fixed with cable ties. The electronics are now fully installed. The hoses, which have been cut to length, must now be inserted. A small drill can be used to press the hoses into shape. If the correct outer diameter has been used for the hoses, they will fit perfectly so that no glue is required. The cover of the housing can now be screwed on. Make sure that no cable or hose is trapped. Finally, screw on the feet. To ensure that an APEROL glass fits underneath when tapping, the APEROLiker can now be placed on the extended feet.
The APEROLiker is ready and the correct firmware can now be installed. Your APEROLiker team wishes you lots of fun with your APEROLiker. Send the pictures of your build and your results to APEROliker.HUGOliker@gmail.com and make the developer happy. You can find the email address at the end of the instructions and in the description text of this video.